Hey everybody, I'm Kris White with the American Battlefield Trust, and we are standing outside what is left of Fort Fisher, which is a North Carolina state historic site here just outside of Wilmington, North Carolina, and it's a really awesome place to come down and visit. We hope that you'll get down here. It's very close to the North Carolina State Aquarium. Actually, if those mountains of Fort Fisher weren't here, you'd see the peak of the dome of the aquarium down there. But we're joined here today in Wilmington by Chris Fonvielle, who is a historian, an author, a professor emeritus. I mean, he does a little bit of everything, and he is the man when it comes to Wilmington and the Civil War. So Chris, I want to start off by talking about Wilmington, North Carolina. Why is it important to the Confederacy? Where are we situated in North Carolina? And why should we have a big fortification here?
Okay, Wilmington was North Carolina's principal seaport before the Civil War. It was the largest city. It's on the Cape Fear River, which flows directly into the Atlantic Ocean, the only river in North Carolina that does that. There were two entryways into the river at the time, separated by Bald Head Island and Frying Pan Shoals, which gave Confederate commerce vessels called blockade runners a choice of entry and exit at the harbor. And so that was crucial. No other southern seaport, not Norfolk, Charleston, New Orleans, none of them ever had that geographic advantage. So that's why Wilmington became so important to the blockade running trade and the supply for the Confederacy. In fact, by 1863, Wilmington became the Confederacy's principal seaport after Charleston was put under siege, and became Robert E. Lee's main artery of supplies. In fact, as early as January of that year, Robert E. Lee said Wilmington must be defended at all hazards. And by 1864, he said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So the blockade running trade through Wilmington, the lifeline of the Confederacy, ran right past Fort Fisher. So Fort Fisher guarded the northern entryway into the Cape Fear Harbor. It's called New Inlet. Other fortifications guarded Old Inlet, but this became the principal and most popular spot for entryway into the harbor for blockade runners coming out of Bermuda, a British neutral transshipment point. And Great Britain, as y'all know, was the Confederacy's main trading partner. So they preferred using New Inlet, and particularly after Fort Fisher was well underway to becoming the Confederacy's strongest, largest seacoast fortification. And some historians and engineers argue that this was the strongest, largest fortification in North America at the time of the Civil War.
So it's interesting to orient you. So we're on basically a peninsula between the Cape Fear River to my left, the Atlantic Ocean to my right. We're facing south. Wilmington's above us, and Bermuda is what, about a 2-day journey, almost straight to the east from here, correct?
Right. It's 674 miles, almost due east. Wilmington is approximately 20 miles north of us, and so these works were built to protect New Inlet for the blockade runners, and of course protect the port facilities at Wilmington and the railroads that tapped into Wilmington. There were 3 railroads, the most important which was the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, which became Lee's lifeline. So that's the importance of Fort Fisher, why it was built where it was. And in fact, Wilmington was the most heavily fortified city along the Atlantic seaboard, with the exception of Charleston. Instead of going after Wilmington early in the war, federal forces hopscotched over the city and went after Charleston instead, because of course that's where political and popular interest settled. In retrospect, one Union naval admiral said, had Wilmington been captured in 1862 or 1863, as the Navy Department proposed, the war would have ended at least a year earlier, and hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved.
Yeah, and if you think about it, Wilmington in a way is very well located if you're living here throughout most of the Civil War, because you have Virginia as a buffer, you have South Carolina, Tennessee, you have Georgia as buffers, and it's going to take a long time for the Union armies to finally make their way down towards North Carolina, and it's going to have to be Sherman moving up from the south, and then a Union naval force as well as an army force, a combined operations, as we would say, or joint task force coming in here today to land them via an amphibious landing. So it's a pretty good place to be if you're living in the Southern Confederacy. So Chris, I think we need to walk a little bit and talk. Let's talk about Fort Fisher. So this is the largest, fortification in the Confederacy, one of the largest on North American soil. What makes it so special, and who designs this fort and commands it?
The fortification, of course, was considered virtually indestructible because it's made of beach sand. Sand was a readily available construction material. Remember that before the war, forts were made of wood or stone and brick. But because of the advancement in weaponry by the time of the Civil War, those forts could be reduced fairly easily with heavy artillery fire. Take Fort Pulaski, for example, which was reduced in about 18 hours in 1862. So the Confederates used what was readily available to them. It was just under their feet. They just needed shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, and laborers. So using enslaved and later free African Americans as well as Confederate soldiers, they came here beginning in April of 1861 and started clearing and started digging. And by the time the fort was attacked in December of 1864 for the first time, Union and Confederate observers alike considered Fort Fisher impregnable. And they called it the Malakoff Tower of the South, likening it to the Russian stronghold that French forces spent 11 months laying siege to during the Crimean War in 1855. So this was a massive fortification. And in fact, after Union forces captured it in mid-January of 65, Admiral David Dixon Porter, who commanded the Naval Task Force, said that he was shocked that they captured it as quickly as they did.
Yeah, to put into perspective about fortifications in the Civil War, there is a man at West Point. His name's Dennis Hart Mahan. He's going to teach you all about fortifications. He goes over to France for 4 years, learns about the great architectural genius that is Sebastien Vauban, who is Louis XIV's chief engineer, and he built fortifications used all the way through the World Wars, even though he's alive in the 1600s. So what happens with fortifications over the years is they go from higher to lower as artillery improves. So you had high towers whenever you're only using archers during the medieval times who could fire down upon you. Once the advent of cannon and gunpowder come in, you have to reduce the size of your fortifications, bring them down, lower their silhouettes so that they're harder to destroy. And Dennis Hart Mahan, when he's writing his treatise on how to build the fortifications, both Union and Confederate soldiers are reading, or future Union and Confederate soldiers are reading his book. He puts in there about 12 and a half chapters on how to build fortifications and 1/2 chapter on how to attack them. So whenever you're saying, why do these guys do this or do that, they're making it up as they go. And they're actually using the same exact manual. I have a Confederate copy of Dennis Hart Mahan's a treaty on how to build fortifications. All the Confederates did was take his book, steal the copyright, and reprint it in Charleston, South Carolina in 1862. So they're literally using the same book to build the fortifications.
And I think I hear people clamoring for more international stuff and more French pronunciations from Kris White.
So Chris,
I'll go to France and do this with you.
yeah, absolutely. So Chris,
And I am a Fonvielle. I'm French Huguenot.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Let's go.
We need to start using the correct pronunciations. And so, you know, it's impressive that you said this is made a lot out of sand. You know, it's primarily out of sand. The U.S. Army during the first Gulf War runs into sand bunkers and fortifications that they have to deal with. They actually have to invent new bunker busters at the Aberdeen Proving Ground to break these up in the middle of the war. So now we have kind of the same thing happening here, where the Union Navy and Army have to figure out how to breach this fortification. So who's our commanding officers down here in Wilmington throughout the war? Who's going to be constructing this impressive fort? And swing around here.
Well, a couple of observations to add to what you were saying, Chris. In your mind's eye, imagine that all of the ground 1/2 mile north of the fort was cleared off for a field of fire. So any enemy troops that approached within 1/2 mile could easily be seen by gunners in the fort. The wood from the old maritime forest was used in the construction of the fort, building bomb proofs underneath the ramparts, and barracks and warehouses and a brig, and eventually to build this palisade, which would be another obstacle to advancing Union infantry. And from the Union sailors' perspective, funny you should say that about the lowering of the size of the fortifications. These are elevated gun batteries, and the ones along the sea face, because it was built from a bird's eye view, it looked like a big giant number 7, with a northern land front that ran from the Cape Fear River to our east for about 500 yards to the Atlantic Ocean, where it made a 90-degree turn at a tall 32-foot high bastion called the Northeast Bastion because it was in the northeast corner of the fort, ran for about 1,900 yards to the south, and the batteries over there were built for ricochet fire against Union gunboats along the shoreline. And this was built to guard the land approaches to the fort in case Union troops made a landing above the fort and then advanced southward to attack, which is exactly what happened. But Union sailors said, from our perspective, about 2 miles offshore, the fort really looked like a bunch of haycocks. We could just barely see them. But what they could see, of course, above them were the flags, which they would use as rangefinders during the first attack on the fort. The fort went through a number of command changes early on. I mean, there was nothing here in 1861 when, in April, Charles Patterson Bowles, who was a civil engineer, the Confederacy was still desperate for military engineers, came here and started building batteries. And a number of commanders came and went until July 4th, 1862, when Colonel William Lamb of Virginia was assigned to take command here. He came over from Fort Anderson, where we'll be later this afternoon, and then determined as a novice or an amateur military engineer that he would build a fort that could withstand the bombardment of the largest fleet in the United States Navy. And ultimately, that's what he did. Under the supervision of Major General William Henry Chase Whiting, who was the commander of the district, later Department of the Cape Fear, this fort was transformed into the mighty bastion and stronghold that it became.
So there's two things I want to unpack there. Number one, we're talking ricochet fire. That means we're going to skip the balls across.
That's correct.
Across the water. The idea is most people think a cannonball is going to arc going through the air all the time. That's what you want to do. Actually, the round balls especially, what you want to do is try to skip it across the ground or across the water, because you need to hit that ship at the water line. If you take down its rigging, if we're using a sailing vessel or a steam/sail rigging, you can slow down the ship, but you're not going to sink the ship. Now, if you're dealing with a monitor class, they have a very low profile in the water, and you'll be lucky to try to hit that cheese box on a raft. So that's number one. Number two, as a North Carolinian, how do you feel for having a Virginian in charge of these North Carolina fortifications?
It's funny you should mention that, because initially they were not happy about this. The principal garrison force here was the 36th North Carolina troops, and here comes a Virginian, and an aristocratic Virginian who had been a newspaper editor and lawyer before the war and knew virtually nothing about military engineering, but he was self-taught and well placed. He turned out to be a brilliant commander and engineer who the troops came to admire, respect, and in fact love by 1864.
There's a saying here in North Carolina about Virginia and South Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I think I may have heard that one. What is that, Chris?
Yeah. Well, we North Carolinians say we live in the Valley of Humility, surrounded by two mountains of conceit. Actually, it's the Vale of Humility, but either way, North Carolinians are very humble people, whereas Virginians and South Carolinians, like to brag about themselves a little bit too much. There is an interesting thought, though, among many civil war historians, is that the war is largely Virginia-centric. Not as much space, and books and articles have been written about the Coastal War, which has been my thing. And so we're trying hard to bring that more to light, and particularly the importance of Wilmington to the Confederate war effort, and ultimately toward Union military operations in 1864 and 1865. It became absolutely crucial to Union military operations to close Wilmington, the last seaport open to trade with the outside world, and its most important city. It was absolutely crucial that they capture the seaport.
It's important that you say that, because think about this. The Civil War starts along the coast. You have Pensacola, which is nearly taken all by Confederate forces. Only Fort Pickens remains because of a young lieutenant named Adam Slemmer, who decides to tell Braxton Bragg, who will eventually show up here, that, basically, no, I'm not giving up my fort. And then you have Fort Sumter that happens. You have the Gosport Naval Yard that falls in Virginia. You also have Fortress Monroe, which was a center, a beehive of activity. So the war really starts, along the coast. It's a very important place. Jefferson Davis knows this in 1862, when Robert E. Lee's second major command is going to be to come down and deal with
the fortifications.
The fortification. So let's take a walk here into Fort Fisher. So Let's fast. Oh,
well,
sorry.
let's just
Yeah.
say one other thing. The Blockade Strategy Board met in September 1861, and they came up with a strategy for fighting the coastal war. And the idea, of course, was to either effectively blockade or to capture the Confederate fortifications. The problem is that the Navy, despite the many proposals that they made to the Lincoln administration and to the War Department for assistance in capturing the fortifications, could not get these political or logistical support to make that happen that early in the war. However, by the spring of 1862, think about this, Chris. Spring of 1862, federal forces had captured the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds, all the major river systems, the Roanoke, the Neuse, the Pamlico Tar. They held all of the river towns, including Newbern, which became the base of operations for the United States Army, and Beaufort, which was the substation for the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, with the main headquarters being in Hampton Roads, Virginia. May 62, they recaptured Norfolk. So by the spring of 1862, federal forces had everything from Norfolk to White Oak Swamp, only 50 miles north of Wilmington. But instead of going after Wilmington, despite these proposals to attack the seaport, they hopscotched over Wilmington and went after Charleston instead. Even Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, frustrated in his attempts to get logistical and political support for an attack on Wilmington, said, well, we may as well skip Wilmington and go after Charleston, which is Satan's kingdom anyway. And Charleston underwent the longest siege of the Civil War, 587 days, and it did not fall. And blockade running companies that had operated at Charleston merely transferred their operations to Wilmington, where the success rate was about 80% for blockade runners, 80%. So there was an incredible amount of money made here. But that also transformed Wilmington into a comparatively quiet, sleepy seaport as to Norfolk and New Orleans, the South's largest city and largest seaport. Wilmington became virtually Las Vegas during the Civil War. It became bawdy, it became violent and dangerous, a lot of money changing hands. So the city was literally transformed. One blockade running sea captain said it had been a staid old town, and then it became topsy-turvy. And a lot of old Wilmington families moved out to escape the change in their town. And but the Confederate government sent troops. They sent sailors and Marines to protect the increasingly important city. Engineers came here to build a vast network of fortifications and batteries to protect the increasingly important seaport and the entryways, the river, the port facilities, the railroads. So Wilmington became, by 1863, the South's main seaport. And I argue that by 1864, it's most important city.
So somebody had to take over New Orleans. That's what I think is going on here. New Orleans falls, so you got to have the debauchery, you got to have the red light district, you got to have all that.
And we're already getting several requests for more topsy-turvy debauchery here on.
Well, then let's bring in Angie Zombeck.
Oh man, I think I may have to cut things out here.
So Chris,
the queen of debauchery.
Oh man, it's getting worse. Do I have to go over to her there? Apparently, that's her title.
Now, come on in, Angie.
Okay, it's not like we're live or anything. Who are you?
I'm Angie Zombeck. I'm assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
All right, good. I think we'll be visiting with you a little bit later.
Yes,
Is that right?
Absolutely.
All right. Are you anxious to get off this subject and out of this frame?
No.
Okay. Well, then let's keep going.
We're talking.
Chris, what do we got?
all right, I think it's interesting. You're pointing out all these inlets being taken, everything in 1862. This is where Ambrose Burnside makes his name for himself. That's why the Ninth Corps has a crossed anchor and as part of its Corps badge, the cannon and the cross anchor for the Corps badge. So, let's talk here before we go up these and talk about these very impressive fortifications. Let's unpack for just a second. You talked about layered defenses here. What all do you have to overcome? You don't just have to overcome Fort Fisher. You have these other forts, Caswell, Anderson. Can we talk about those just for a minute?
Sure. You're right. There were multi-layers of defenses surrounding Wilmington or around Wilmington. General Whiting's great fear was that federal forces, now ensconced in Newbern, North Carolina, just 90 miles north of Wilmington, would attack the city, attack Wilmington overland. They would simply march from Newbern southward to attack Wilmington from the north, where the defenses were weaker. And once you had Wilmington, of course, the forts at the mouth of the batteries were of no consequence whatsoever. So fortifications were built on the north side between Wilmington and New Bern. They were built along the sound areas, because the other option Whiting considered was that Union forces would simply take transports down the coast from New Bern, land on the beaches 9 miles to the east of Wilmington, and then use the creeks, Hewlett's Creek, Bradley Creek, to attack Wilmington from the east, again bypassing the forts at the mouth of the river. That's what federal forces should have done, but they turned out to be fairly apathetic about attacking, being more aggressive early in the war. And again, Porter said, had they been more aggressive and captured Wilmington in 1862 or 63, the war would have ended a lot sooner. But the main fortifications protecting Wilmington were built at the entryways to the Cape Fear Harbor. Old Inlet and New Inlet, separated by the Bald Head Island and Frying Pan Shoals. The distance as the crow flies between the two inlets was about 6 miles. To the outside for Union blockaders, the distance was about 40 miles. And one Union naval officer said, we were like a parcel of cats watching a rat hole that really had 2 ways in and out, and you never knew which hole the rat was going to use. So it was literally a cat and mouse game in trying to capture, intercept, destroy blockade runners that are feeding, arming, and equipping the Confederacy and bringing in supplies for the civilian population as well. And remember, Robert E. Lee said again, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So the lifeline through Wilmington, particularly by 1864, was absolutely crucial to the South's war effort.
So we want to talk about the battle here, but just very quickly, the flies that are going around us are reminding me of something. So can you tell us just for a minute about the daily life here? Are these guys dealing with what I've read at places like Folly Beach, down at Pensacola, down along the other parts of the coast at Port Pulaski? Are they dealing with sand fleas, sand blindness because it's so bright out here? Because actually some Civil War soldiers actually had sunglasses. I have a pair of them. Not these ones, but at home. Can you tell us a little bit about the daily life here inside of the fort?
Chris, I learned more about common soldiers during the Civil War when I reenacted from 1979 to 1983. And I want to tell you, those were tough men in that generation. Of course, you don't know what you don't know. They didn't have air conditioning. I didn't have air conditioning when I was growing up, but you didn't know that you missed air conditioning because nobody had air conditioning. But we're here in early May, and it's fairly pleasant. The wind is blowing. The insects are not too bad, but come back in July and August, it could be really tough. This was a sand spit. Fortunately, because it was so open, you had a nice breeze most days blowing across the Cape that kept the insects down. But on still days, you had to deal with mosquitoes at night, no-see-ums, real small little insects that bore into your skin. You had to deal with the sand. Most Confederate soldiers stationed at Fort Fisher, their comments were about the sand. Sand got into everything. It got into their clothes, it got into their hair, into their eyes, their ears, everything. They could not escape the sand. Got into their food. So it was really tough. On the other hand, these guys are members of a fortification and they don't have the rigors of field duty, marching and so forth, in camping. The food source is pretty good. I mean, they just go out into the river just west of us to harvest oysters or clams or fish. They can go swimming in the Atlantic Ocean. So, you know, it was the best of times and the worst of times.
So we're going to mount these fortifications. We'll have a whole other video just talking about the fortifications here. So if we don't dive into them enough, just tune in for that next video. But we see we have a bomb proof over here.
Yes, we have the facade of a bomb proof. This was the entryway into a bomb-proof underneath what was then called Shepherd's Battery, where soldiers could escape a heavy naval bombardment. Mm-hmm. Underneath each one of the traverses along the ramparts that separated the gun compartments was a bomb-proof or an alternating gunpowder magazine. Unfortunately, when they excavated this battery in the mid-1970s, they did not have the resources to rebuild a bomb-proof. However, there's now a project underway that will reconstruct bomb proofs in the area of the World War II landing strip right in the middle of the old land face, so that visitors will be able to go inside a bomb proof underneath the ramparts to see what the soldiers would have had to have endured on a daily basis, but particularly during the bombardments of Fort Fisher in Christmas 1864 and January of 1865.
That's great. So what we're going to do is we are going to stop this video. This is going to be your introduction to Wilmington and Fort Fisher. And then we are going to climb the ramparts here at Fort Fisher and go through the battle here. So we hope that you keep joining us here on the American Battlefield Trust YouTube and Facebook page. Chris Fonvielle, we want to thank you for being out here. We're starting to get a little warm. It's a great day out here, but the breeze is going. Thanks, Gary, behind the camera. Thanks, Angie. We're sorry that you were brought in on all of our debauchery. And you'll be seeing her a little bit later on today. So on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation.
I'm sorry for the segue. It just kind of seemed to fit all of a sudden.